Hey guys, it's Matt. I hope you're doing well. We're going to do something a little different today. This morning I was up way too early on MS Now with Ali Vitali, and we had a really good discussion about this Republican civil war taking place right now, playing out as we speak between folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massie, and Donald Trump. And it has to do with everything from bombing Iran to the Epstein files to the Obamacare subsidies, whether to renew them. And whether Donald Trump has lost touch with his populist base. So it was a really good discussion. I think we got into some pretty interesting substance. So I encourage you to watch that on MS Now. And but then afterwards, I'm going to talk to, this is even more of a departure from the normal podcast that we do here. But I read a really cool book called Ozzy and Me by a guy named Stephen Ray, who became friends with Ozzy Osbourne at a young age. This was after Black Sabbath, and this was a young man at the time, and they had a 40-year friendship, and he wrote a memoir about it called Ozzy and Me. So I really liked it. So check that out as well. And thanks for watching, and here's my clip.
New analysis from Axios says the movement remains pro-Trump, but it's less influential in driving the president's actual agenda as rifts unfold over what it means to be truly America first when Trump focuses attention on Israel or Venezuela while working-class voters are hurting in America. Feuds include that of Tucker Carlson versus Ben Shapiro over Israel, as well as the rising influence of Nick Fuentes and young white nationalists using racist rhetoric. Meanwhile, a fight over the release of the Epstein files has erupted into a very public split between President Trump and Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. Greene told CNN she still supports Trump, saying her push for accountability on the Epstein documents was about transparency, not disloyalty, adding she hopes the president will deliver for the country.
I think that the American people deserve to be put first. That's what Make America Great Again meant to me. And I think that President Trump can do that if he refocuses his effort. And I think that's what I want to see. I think that's what the country wants to see. Even if he's attacking me, I do want him to be successful for the American people.
Now, Greene says she'd be open to reconciling with the president, but she also accused Trump of fueling dangerous rhetoric that's putting her life now at risk, reporting receiving hoax pizza deliveries and a pipe bomb threat at her business. She also acknowledged that when others were at the center of that kind of ire, she didn't push back, and she apologized for that. In a post on social media, she wrote, "Aggressive rhetoric attacking me has historically led to death threats and multiple convictions of men who were radicalized by the same type of rhetoric being directed at me now, this time by the president of the United States." Still, last night, Trump dismissed those concerns.
We'll see what happens.
Green said her life could be at danger because of the rhetoric.
Her life is in danger? Who's that?
Marjorie Taylor Green, she says.
Marjorie Taylor Green. I don't think her life is in danger. Frankly, I don't think anybody cares about her.
I want to bring in now author, columnist, and conservative writer Matt Lewis. Matt, how things change and how quickly they do. I mean, this is not the kind of rhetoric that any public official or anyone should be subjected to. And yet you see now Marjorie Taylor Greene seemingly aware of the fact that, yeah, it's her at the center of it right now, but dozens of other politicians and public figures have been at the center of Trump's ire and received exactly this kind of treatment, from Nikki Haley to tons and tons of other Democrats. So her reaction, I mean, what do you make of the fact that this is going on, that she's acknowledging that she's only just realizing the power of the president's words now? I mean, talk about what you see happening here.
I think there's a real eye-opening moment right now. You have someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I think for the first time maybe, and I think she's actually in many ways a true believer. I think she drank the Kool-Aid sincerely. She believes in MAGA more than Donald Trump believes in MAGA as an ideology. And I think her eyes have, to a certain degree, been opened to. If you listen to her talk, she actually is talking about the power of words to possibly be dangerous and inspire violence. And she says this is maybe an epiphany after Charlie Kirk. But this reminds me of something else that's happening right now, which are conservative movement leaders and conservative opinion leaders who have suddenly discovered that, oh my gosh, anti-Semitism is a problem out there, that we've built this monster over the last decade. And now, so on multiple fronts, I think you have people on the right who are now coming to realize, some of them, that they have helped build this monster, and now they have to find a way to restrain it, or it will come to get them, as monsters usually do.
Yeah, as they always do. I mean, look, the fact that she's realizing the impact of words on the horrifying landscape of political violence that we're seeing, good. Everyone within politics right now should take a look at this landscape and do what they can to try to cool things off, bring passion to debates, but then also not make it.
When you've got a classic ride, you need tools you trust. Whether you drive it every day or only take it out on the biggest night of the year, count on Harbor Freight. Early Black Friday is here.
It looks like an ordinary staircase, but as you age with occasional nerve discomfort that can feel like stabbing or pins and needles in your hands and feet, sometimes stairs can bring worry. As a retired physician, I've seen it in my patients, but I didn't truly understand it until I got older myself. So
It's usually whichever party or side is the most unified wins. And up until recently, clearly, I think Democrats have been having this identity crisis. What do they stand for? But right now, we have seen, and certainly after the 2025 elections in New Jersey, Virginia, New York City, Republicans are having these internal battles, trying to figure out who's in charge. I also think a lot of this jockeying, frankly, though, isn't about 2026. It's really about 2028.
Yes.
Some of it also is just the product of Donald Trump now being perceived as a lame duck, I think rightly so. I think he always crafted this really unwieldy coalition for 2024 that was probably unsustainable. I think physically, he's just not up to it anymore, to the degree that he was able to kind of impose his will on people. He doesn't just have the energy, maybe physically. But I also think there's something else here. You know, Donald Trump used to go around the country doing these rallies all the time, and it was sort of a focus group. He would say something crazy, the audience would either respond positively or negatively, and it helped him craft his message to appeal to kind of a populist constituency. I don't think he has that now. He's hearing from ideologues like Stephen Miller, or he's hearing from billionaires, you know, in his cabinet, or donors. And so Donald Trump, I think, is increasingly isolated and out of touch with his own populist movement.
As someone who went to, I think, more than 250 of those rallies, it was always a way for him to litmus test. And he would actively poll the crowd. Do you think I should do this? Do you think I should do this? On everything from his VP choice to policy decisions. I think you're right about that. But then I also look at the way that you frame it as the ideologues and the billionaires. And those are actually two different places of policy nexuses, right? And what I see happening here is that Trump is, you're right, the head of a coalition that was never going to sustain beyond him, but it's going to be a problem for whoever comes next. J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, even in those two names, they're going to have different prescriptions on what the party should stand for. So ultimately, where do you think that this goes next, as the party is actively grappling with being post-Trump, even as it is very much amid the Trump era?
This is going to be a complete mess, right? Because you've got a few dynamics happening. First, people are running for 2028, whether they admit to it or not. I mean, they're going to start jockeying for position. And the way you jockey for position is not to be the same. Because if everyone is identical, then J.D. Vance is the obvious heir apparent. So it's to try to separate yourself. If you're Ted Cruz, how do you make an argument? If you're Marco Rubio, I think Marjorie Taylor Green possibly is now running for president. So the fact that there is now a shadow 2028 campaign, I think inevitably leads to conflict. Republicans are not afraid of Donald Trump anymore. We're seeing this with Marjorie Taylor Greene. We're seeing this with Thomas Massie. We're seeing this in Indiana, where local Republicans are defying Donald Trump. And so I think the spell is starting to break. And the question, though, for Republicans is, after we get through all this turmoil and fighting, can anybody have the charisma of Donald Trump, right? Because one thing we've seen in the last decade is when Trump is on the ballot, they have a good chance of winning.
Yes.
When Donald Trump's not on the ballot, not so much. And so all this fighting, and then you get to someone who maybe just doesn't have it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you say it's going to be a complete mess. I think that's kind phrasing to do it. Matt Lewis, we will leave it there. Thank you, as always, for coming on.
Thank you. All right, now we're going to turn to Stephen Ray, who is out with a great new memoir called Ozzy and Me. Life lessons, wild stories, and unexpected epiphanies from 40 years of friendship with the Prince of Darkness, Stephen Ray. Great to talk with you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I enjoyed this memoir. So it starts with you basically, you're a kid in Ireland. You love Ozzy Osbourne. Your mom writes a letter to the Ozzy fan club saying, we're thinking of going to Rio to rock in Rio to see Ozzy. Ozzy's manager gets back to you, or a business person, and gets back and says, hey, if you guys travel all the way there, you know what? We're going to pay for the tickets. You're going to meet Ozzy, which in and of itself would be an amazing story. But like, how do you go from that to being friends with Ozzy Osbourne? That's amazing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, everything you said there is true. And I think one of the things that I've sort of realized in writing this book is the story that you sort of previewed there. That's right. My mom wrote a letter to the fan club. Ozzy's secretary picked up the phone and called my mom and said, hey, if you guys make it, we'll take care of you. And even what happened to me in Rio was fantastic. I got to meet Ozzy. I got a backstage pass. I got to stand at the side of the stage to watch these bands. And then to top it all, on the last day, Ozzy invited me, my parents, me and my parents to breakfast with him. So we had there were no handlers, no security, no assistants, just me and my parents and Ozzy at breakfast. And even that sort of 10 days, that would have been fantastic as a 15-year-old Ozzy fanatic. And that would have, I would have had a story to tell for the rest of my life, kind of thing. But a couple of things that sort of laid on, one that laid on their further relationship development. One of the things was that it was obviously before the internet. This is 40 years ago. So one of the things was they were developing and ramping up the fan club that you mentioned. And they wanted to have more of a presence and engagement with the fans. And Ozzy's secretary, although she spent her sort of working life in the music business, she wasn't an Ozzy fan. She didn't have that knowledge that 15-year-old fans have. So, and this is years before Google and the internet. So she would call me. People would write to the fan club and say, what was the B-side of this single? Where are the lyrics to this song? Who was in the band when they recorded such and such an album? And she would call me. I was like,
yeah. And Ozzy probably didn't even know the answers to these questions, right?
No. I mean, one of the lines that Jack uses in the forward was, he said, Stephen was there in the 80s, a decade my dad famously doesn't remember. not like a night out or blackout drunk. It's like a decade that he doesn't really remember. So yeah, so that was one of the reasons. One was that I was, available for them to help them. And I was sort of 15, 16 years old. I wanted to go into writing. I wanted to go into journalism. And of course, it's Ozzy Osbourne's secretary. So of course I would write articles and do whatever I could for the fan club. And then about a year after Rio, he launched his next album and he did a UK and Irish and UK tour of a month. And I just sort of cut out of school at 16. I just took a month off school and I'd been saving for a year. And my plan was to hop on buses and stay at youth hostels and basically just follow the tour. And the same thing happened. Ozzy and Sharon said, you're coming on our tour bus. They took me on their tour bus. They paid for all my hotels. They gave me an unlimited access backstage pass. And so I think that was like a year after Rio. So that sort of cemented me further into the organization, setup, entourage, whatever you want to say. And so it was just the sort of right. And also because I was young, I was 16. And I think that they've always had this sort of family atmosphere type, family vibe. And I think they saw me, they sort of took me under their wing. They saw me as a kid, which I was 16 years old. And they kind of, there was like that sort of, this kid needs looking after. We can't throw him to the wolves kind of thing, which of course there was no reason for them to do that. And they had no responsibility to do that. But again, it just sort of speaks to the character, what those guys are.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing because, I mean, I think the image of Ozzy Osbourne, certainly like in that era, would have been, he's a Satanist. And so the fact that he and Sharon both were watching out for you and very family oriented kind of plays against type. How much of the satanic thing was real versus show?
Oh, it was all show. It was all show. I mean, you mentioned that, like, that tour, and even later tours, 86, 88. Ozzy and Sharon had 3 kids close together, 83, 80, 45. And so at gigs, the kids were there. It was kids and Lego and giant teapots and Mr. Men. It wasn't, we weren't backstage killing black chickens and drinking goat's blood and, drawing pentagrams on the, of course not. It was a role he played. But when Bela Lugosi played Dracula, he didn't go home at night and sleep in a coffin. It was his persona. It was his image. And don't get me wrong, they absolutely lent into that image. He is the Prince of Darkness. He is the guy that mothers don't want their children to go to watch. And absolutely, he played up to that, and Sharon played into that image. But there was never anything at all in real life.
So your parents must have been pretty cool. I mean, you probably got a much better education on the road than you would have gotten sitting in a classroom. But most parents would be a little nervous about letting their kids follow any rock star around, let alone the Prince of Darkness.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's a couple of things that and writing the book, writing the book took a long time. And one of the things I was like constantly amazed, going, wait, I did this, or my parents, because you're looking at the distance of 40 years. And also, actually, I have a daughter now who's 18. So when I was writing this book, she was like 13, 14, 15, 16. I was like, I wouldn't let my daughter cross the road on her own at 13, never mind. So, yeah, so my parents were very cool, as you said. A couple of things. One is they had met Ozzy and Sharon. They met them in Rio. They spent time with them in Rio. They knew they weren't, crazy wild, that they trusted them, I guess. And the other thing was my parents were very young. I mean, my mom had me when she was 17. They were they some of the children of the 60s. They lived through music. And my dad was actually in a band. So they had that, they understood the power of music. And I was a sort of responsible kid. This is before cash apps and before being able to track people on their phone and stuff. And yeah, I mean, I was 16 years old and I said, I'm not going to school anymore. Well, I didn't leave school at 16, but for the next like 2 weeks, as long as my money lasts, I'm going to go to a different country and I'm going to follow this rock star around, and I'll phone you every few days and let you know I'm still alive, kind of thing, which I did. And of course, because I wasn't spending any money, because they were paying for my hotels and they were taking me on the tour bus, my money lasted the whole 4 weeks or a month or whatever it was. So again, it was just like a confluence of events, really, that I was lucky with.
Sharon strikes me as like sort of a Kris Jenner figure, where like utterly brilliant at marketing and business. And I mean, obviously Ozzy was incredibly talented, but it seems to me that Sharon took him to another level. Is that perception right? Like, how good is Sharon when it comes to like managing a career?
Absolutely. I mean, not only did she take his career to another level, she saved his life. I mean, I think he has said that on many occasions. When he was fired from Black Sabbath, he was down and out. I mean, he was drinking himself to death. He would have been dead within a couple of years. And instead, she was the one that got hold of him and shook him and said, "You're the guy with the talent. You're the guy with the voice. We are going to represent you." And so, yes, absolutely.
Her dad had been Sabbath's manager, right?
That's right. And there's a long and tangled story about her and her dad and about management and all sorts of stuff. But the bottom line was, and we talk today. Sometimes I think about it, and the sort of where we are as a society now, as in a sort of sexism. Excuse me, from the point of view of sexism and men and female, and how today we're much more aware of women being in positions of power. But can you imagine being in the heavy metal world in the early 80s? And not only that, you're managing Ozzy Osbourne. And how many female heavy metal managers do you think there were in the 80s?
And she's younger and very attractive. She had to be tough to pull that off.
Without a doubt. So she she not only saved his life, but absolutely, I agree with you 100%. She took his career to another level. I tell the story in the book about the early 90s. I was back home in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and I got a call, and Sharon was worried that in Germany's the biggest market in Europe, and she was worried that Ozzy wasn't getting promoted enough in Germany. And she had me fly to, I think it was Berlin and Hamburg, maybe it was a couple of cities in Germany that either he had just played or was about to play, and asked me to go around every record store and make a note of how much Aussie product was on the shelves. I mean, think about that. She paid for that. That was out of her own pocket. She was like, you fly to Germany, do me a report, because I want to then be able to go to the German record company on Monday morning and say, hey, you're supposed to be pushing this album. And on Saturday afternoon, that you only had 4 copies on sale in Hamburg or whatever it may be.
I saw rumors on the internet that Ozzy Osbourne, before he died, became a Christian. And then other people say Ozzy was always a Christian, actually. He didn't go to church, but he was a Christian. I don't know if you were at his funeral, you're friends with Jack. Any validity to that, or is this just a way to get clicks from people?
Yeah, not as far as I know. Not. I mean, he was a Christian in the sense if we'd go to press conferences and he would say he was Church of England. He was Christian in the sense of like the Christian upbringing or the Christian belief. But I mean, I have no knowledge that he ever went to church or ever anything ever changed for him in those last couple of months.
He obviously, you mentioned how Sharon rescued him, but he had years of struggles with alcoholism. And I know you would sometimes hang out with him and drink with him. And I'm sure that was super fun, especially if you're like in your 20s or something, hanging out with Ozzy. Talk, if you would, about his relationship with alcohol, the struggle with alcohol, and how that played into your relationship.
Yeah, and so even as a youngster, at sort of 15, 16, I mean, I had some of the greatest, most fun-filled nights of my life with Ozzy. I mean, again, if you just think about it, you're 16 years old, you're on tour with Ozzy Osbourne. I mean, it's just incredible thinking about it today. And so we would stay up like all night. We would go to bed at dawn sometimes. He would just drink like all night. And of course, I thought this was the greatest thing ever because I'm spending, I've got like a lifetime of stories of the time the time I went on tour and we drank all night. So, but even at that age, I knew it wasn't sustainable. I mean, Ozzy said himself, he was drinking himself to death. I mean, he knew Ozzy in the 40 years I knew, it was a constant battle for Ozzy. Ozzy wasn't stupid. A lot of people sort of saw him on TV or the Osbournes and they thought he slurred his words or he sort of bumbled a bit or he shuffled and they were like, oh, this guy's an idiot. And people underestimated Ozzy. He was clever. He was sharp. He never missed anything. And so Ozzy knew that nothing good was going to come from his alcoholism. And for him, and he relapsed plenty of times. He was sober. I would go on tours and he would be sober and we would go up to his room and have a cup of tea and a slice of cake and everything. He was completely sober. And in other times, maybe years later, he would have relapsed and he was big into prescription drugs. He had an addictive personality where if he went and found a new chocolate bar he liked, he wouldn't go and buy one. He'd buy like 40 and eat them all that day. I mean, that was just his personality, So Ozzy knew that he was battling alcoholism. He knew it was like a lifetime struggle and that there were periods in his life where it beat him and there were periods where he beat it.
Well, speaking of Ozzy being, crazy like a fox or more clever, there's a thing in American politics where George H.W. Bush back in the early 90s was mocked because they claimed he didn't know how to run a grocery store scanner. but it's a very unfair hit because it was like a brand new type of scanner. And anyway, he got a raw deal by the media. A similar thing happened to Ozzy, right? Where there's this famous, these clips of him trying to work a remote control, going Sharon, but as it turns out, you were saying that like you couldn't work that remote control either, right?
No, of course, and it's Ozzy. So Ozzy and Sharon they've always earned their money, but they've always had like expensive tastes. And so their TV system isn't a regular TV system like you and I have, just with a bigger screen. I mean, it's a space age thing that you need the programmers from the NASA space project to be able to turn on and off and put the sound up and down or whatever. So yeah, if anybody went to his house and was handed, here's 5 remotes, which one does this and which does this, and of course, as you've got your satellite. You've got your cable, you've got the TV, you've got a DVD player back then, or it was all. It's and that's the sort of the deal you make with TV, of course, is that you sign your life away, and then they can edit this or that, and to make you look this. Or I mean, I've had enough experience of the TV world to know this is the game, So, but I get. I understand if you're only seeing clips here or there and, you don't know Ozzy. Again, I tell the story in the book that Ozzy said to me one day, he was talking to a woman and she said that he mentioned his music and she went, wait, you're a musician? And she never knew him from, he had, before the Osbournes came out, he had a 35-year career, whatever it was, in the music business. He was one of the greatest hard rock singers of all time, and yet there's probably millions of people who didn't even know that.
Amazing. People thought he was just a reality TV star, right?
Right.
So I'm going to give you I'm not an Ozzy completist or a fanatic, but I'm of a certain age. I'm going to confess my, I think, unpopular opinion, and you tell me if I'm the only person in the world, but my favorite album of his is No Rest for the Wicked.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's Zakk Wylde, right? That he's the guitarist on that one. Do I have an argument, or does this make me outside of the mainstream?
Well, I think you shocked. I'll give you completely shocked me there. I think you might be the first person I've ever met in my life who says No Rest for the Wicked is their favorite Ozzy album. But I am. Then to use your term, a completist, because I'm an Ozzy fanatic. So I would listen to everything. And certainly No Rest for the Wicked. That it was Zakk Wylde's first album, and I worked on that tour. So some of those songs, it was their first time he'd ever played them live. So absolutely, I love that album, and I think there's some great stuff in that album. But I'm surprised you think it's as.
I think it's, what I think it is. I think it was like that. It's sort of like Saturday Night Live. Everybody thinks the best season is whatever when they were 15 years old or whatever, right? And so for me, that I think it was just it hit me at the right time. But Bloodbath in Paradise, Devil's Daughter, that was about sort of the televangelist phenomenon.
And funny, I read something fairly recently about that was, I'm a big soccer fan, and I read something the other day by a writer who said something very similar. He said the best World Cup is the World Cup you watched when you were 14 years old, or the nearest to 4. So that makes sense. And I guess for me, his Ozzy's second album, Diary of a Madman, which came out in 1981, was the one that I sort of where I fell in love with Ozzy, and it's actually taken me a while to listen to Ozzy since July, and just last week actually I put some music on for the first time, and it was Diary of a Madman that I went to. I think that's his best album, and I think it's a really strong album, but if I had been 3 years older or 3 years younger, I could well have been saying, no, it was No Rest for the Wicked, or it was Blizzard of Oz, or whatever it may be. So that makes perfect sense.
Well, I've never heard anyone else have my opinion, but maybe I'm not crazy.
Yeah, it's good. That's nothing wrong with that.
So, some of the time, Sharon started this, or Ozzy and Sharon started Ozfest, and there were a couple of reunions with Black Sabbath. So you got to travel eventually, not just with Ozzy, but with Black Sabbath. And so there must have been a lot of egos at play because, as you noted earlier, they kicked Ozzy out of the band. But now Ozzy's more famous and successful than they are. So what was that dynamic like, having these two worlds that you're working for both of them at certain points?
Yeah, and I'll tell you a story that that I haven't talked about really about this book is it was the head of Simon and Schuster, my publisher, who sort of came up with the subtitle or the strapline, whatever you want to call it. And he sort of said he put in unexpected epiphanies. And I remember having this discussion with him and saying, I'm not really sure what this means. What do we do? And he said, just look for occasions in the book where you sort of learn something that you maybe translated to your life. And I think that Sabbath tour was one of those such occasions, because I had been ingratiated with Ozzy, as you said, from like 85. And the tour was 97. So for like a decade or so, I had heard stories about how terrible everything to do with Black Sabbath was and how they had treated Ozzy. And I mean, at some stage, I think Sharon was wrapping up her daughter's number twos and putting them in boxes and sending them to Tony Iommi in Tiffany boxes, and beautiful Tiffany boxes. We'd be like, oh, I got something from Tiffany. Anyway, so there was a lot of rancor, a lot of bad blood. And then suddenly we're everyone's friends again. And so those of us from the Ozzy camp who had worked for Ozzy and were loyal to Ozzy were suddenly sort of subsumed into this Black Sabbath machine. And so there were difficulties for sure, because Ozzy was headlining arenas. Ozzy was selling out to 20,000 people. Black Sabbath at that time were playing clubs in America, so they're playing to, and because you're younger and because you think you know everything, throughout it, I had, who do they think they are? They need Ozzy. They need him. That he's the guy that made a success. You guys are has-beens, kind of thing. And then you sort of realize it's called the music business. It's a business. And so that first tour, as you mentioned, I was lucky enough to work on, and I saw it every night. From a business perspective, it was fantastically successful. From a musical perspective, I had seen Ozzy do Black Sabbath songs for 20 years at that stage, but they just sounded different with Black Sabbath. It's incredible. It was just different and better. And the last thing was from a sort of personal, emotional level. It was the three, they had issues with the drummer, so he didn't come, but it was basically 3 out of the 4 original Black Sabbath members. And I was the bass player geezer, I was his assistant. And so Ozzy's had his own dressing room with his assistant. And then Tony Iommi, the guitarist, he had an assistant, but he was also a guitar tech, so he had to be out, tuning the guitar, basically doing that. So often it was just me and Tony and Geezer in the dressing room. But Ozzy would always come in to their dressing room. And so, again, at a distance of 20, 30 years, whatever it is, I realize now how lucky I was, the only person, not like the only person aged this, but the only person often in that dressing room with the 3 original Sabbath guys interacting with each other. And I got to see, and even despite everything, and despite decades of slinging mud at each other, and despite everything and all the battles and all the legal arguments and everything else, you could tell that these were 3 guys that shared this bond like nobody else did.
Yeah, you had this amazing experience because you were, you worked for Ozzy at different points, but you were also friends with Ozzy and his family for decades. And, it's actually hard if you're famous to have real friends, you know, because like, are the roadies really your friends? Or they're, you know, groupies and all these different, what's the word? Liggers, what's
Ligger,
the
yeah, that's right. Ligger,
ligger,
yeah.
the sort of
Yeah,
hangers on.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But you were like, you became like a real friend of theirs, and you weren't trying to get anything from them. I think over time that really developed. And it seems, I mean, it just hearing your stories and reading the book, it just seems like Ozzy, who I'm sure was a flawed person who did some bad things in his life, but it seems like he was fundamentally a nice and funny guy. Would you agree with that? Is that accurate?
100%. Yeah, he was the funniest guy I ever met, in the sense that he would just say things, and you know, just off the top of his head, and they would absolutely, you know, have us in stitches. Unfortunately, because of the length of the book, you know, I had to cut sort of a lot of the stories. But the things he used to do, the joke, like simple, I don't mean, you know, a lot of them were alcohol fueled, but they weren't. They were just like good natured pranks and you know, just playing tricks on people. Just so he was really funny, but also absolutely. And I can't tell you again the amount of times that he visited people in hospital, that he answered calls from disabled vets and that kind of the amount of things that he did, and he would only do on the understanding there would be no publicity. I agree with you. He was a fundamentally nice guy. Of course, his life wasn't normal. Of course, he had to live in the public eye, and of course, by the nature of the beast, there's going to be times when things happen, and he's going to lose his temper or whatever. But beneath it all, in general, day to day, if you ever see, I remember there was a poll back in the old music magazines, and it was, there was like some sort of all-time great, you know, poll vote or whatever, and they said, who is the nicest rock star you have ever met? And Ozzy was always number one. He absolutely always had time for his fans. I don't think I ever saw him, maybe once or twice in 40 years, because he was eating, did I see him refuse an autograph. I think maybe I can think of one occasion when he was eating and somebody came up and asked for his autograph, and he was like, hey, you know, kind of finish my dinner kind of thing. But other than that, he would stand at, you know, freezing cold at 2 a.m. Kids would show up at the hotel, and he would go out, he would sign. Absolutely. He was a good guy.
He was a huge, and I think you are too, a huge World War II fan and a big viewer of World War II documentaries. Where did that come from, and how was that? Is that something that you guys were able to bond over?
Well, yeah, that's all we talked about. That's all. Well, that's an exaggeration, but we would talk about World War II a lot. He grew up in Birmingham. He was born in 48. Birmingham was you know, it's like an industrial town back in the days when, of course, when England built things. But it was an industrial town. He grew up just after the Second World War, but much of it, you know, England was battered by the Second World War. It was destroyed, and it took a long time to recover. So he grew up to it much closer than I did. I was born sort of 25 years after the end of the war, but my granddad was in the Royal Air Force for many years, for decades. And so I was always interested in history and World War II, because I hear his stories even before I met Ozzy. And then Ozzy, we had the same, you know, we had the same interest. So we would buy each other books on World War II. And again, this is sort of before the internet. Now, of course, you can just click on and watch a YouTube video. But back then, you know, it was the History Channel. Or the World War II the World at War. We would sit and watch those and talk about those, and often we'd go years without seeing each other, because I would be in Belfast or he'd be in LA or whatever, and often we wouldn't see each other for years. But when we did, it was usually, where have you been, you know? And I would be like, oh, I've been to this place, or I went diving in the Solomon Islands. He's like, I finally got to go and see Auschwitz or whatever. So we always had, you know, we were, both of us were big World War II buffs for sure. I still am, actually.
You know, you mentioned toward the end that you maybe didn't see him as much, and I've had this experience where I've been around close to famous people, and there's a lot of demands on their time, and at a certain point, you kind of feel that you're maybe fading away, that you're fading. What was what was that like, having the sense maybe at points where, like, wow, I used to be on the road, hanging out with Ozzy and Sharon, and now you were running your own travel agency for a long time in Ireland. In some cases, while you were on the road, but I'm not sure everyone understands what it's like to
Yeah.
be personal friends with. Like, I worked for Tucker Carlson for 6 years, for example. I used to see him in my office, go to lunch with him and stuff like that. And then next thing you know, he's got his own TV show on Fox,
Yeah.
and you can still text with him. But he's very busy, not
Yeah.
quite as busy as he is. What was that like? What is that like for
So
those who
I
haven't been
understand.
there?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I never felt. I never sat at home and went, "Oh, I used to be his friend and I'm not anymore." Because a couple of things. One is I was always grateful for the time I had. You know, I go into it a bit more detail in the book, but when Black Sabbath reformed, I had worked on tour with Ozzy for a few years, and then when Black Sabbath reformed, they obviously had. I think they wanted to bring more of their own people in. They wanted to be more equal. Whenever we first started, it was all Ozzy's guys. Ozzy, you know, and suddenly was like, "Hey, we're blacks, and we're going to have our guys do this and do this and do this." But I didn't. I didn't sit at home and go, "I've lost my job and I wanted a tour, and why did they?" I was like, you know what? I had those years with Ozzy. You can never take those away, and if I don't get them again, that's okay. You know, I was always grateful for what I had, as opposed to being bitter about what I'd lost. Secondly, I was always when I used to stay at the house sometimes, and again, this is kind of before cell phones really took off, the phone would ring constantly. Constantly, the phone would go. You know, so Sharon's got an office in LA, she's maybe back in London for a month or whatever, and everybody's phoning her all the time. And I always thought, when I wasn't around them or with them, there's no way I am picking up the phone and calling them, because all I'm doing is adding to their burden. Like you said, they're busy people. They have a million people who want to speak to them every day. They don't need to speak to Steve and say, "Hey, how's things? How you doing? What's the weather?"
Yeah,
So
you can't. Yeah.
So absolutely, I would let them call me. But the sort of other thing is, and I'm sure you're aware of this as well, is that even if you're not sort of close to the principal, if you sort of have a relationship with those around them, you know, that and the people who work for them, or the people close to them, you know, that is something you can always say, "Oh, how are they doing today?" or "What's happening?" or "This happening," and you're on the periphery. But that can often be enough. Again, I wrote a chapter at the end, and we sort of squeezed in before publication. And there's a part where one of Ozzy's old bass player says to me, "Once you're in, you're in," and that's, I don't know if that's with.
I love that.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the same with every sort of famous person, but certainly with Ozzy, often people disappeared for years, for decades, that you wouldn't see, and then next thing, the tour manager again, you're like, "Oh, well, I guess he's back now." So I was always aware there were enough people who crossed them. There were enough people who they didn't want part of their organization again because they'd said or done or whatever. And so I was, even though I might not have been Ozzy's best friend for many years, if I saw him, we caught up.
So you were also a journalist for a time. So reading this, I couldn't help but think about Cameron Crowe's Almost Famous, movie. Have you seen that? Was this on your mind as you're writing your memoir?
No, it wasn't. But yeah, absolutely. It's funny. Again, Jack and Ozzy had a TV show called Jack and Ozzy and Jack's World Detour. And for one of the shows, they came to my house, and Jack said to me, "How did you get to meet Dad?" And I told him, and he said, "That's Almost Famous. That's like the plot of Almost." So I have seen that movie a long time ago, but honestly, I feel this story doesn't need any sort of embellishment or any to be like hung on a hook of a movie, because it's just as crazy.
And as you note in the book, that probably couldn't happen today. Like, you couldn't become friends with Ed Sheeran or Taylor Swift in the same way. Partly, I guess, because the internet, they might not need someone someone who's an Ozzy expert to help answer fan mail.
Can you imagine today sending an email to Taylor Swift's fan club and saying that you're going to see her at the concert, and Taylor Swift's people emailing you back and say, that's great, we'll see you at the hotel, here's a backstage pass, come onto the stage and watch the show, come have breakfast with Taylor, the next day. And it just wouldn't. It's a different time. And that was one of the reasons I wrote it. I've sort of been putting off writing, and it was just such a big project and crossed, it's decades of concerts and journals and diaries, and I sort of put it off. And then as I did think, this will never ever happen again. I don't know if it has happened before. I don't know if this, if like in the 70s somebody wrote to Led Zeppelin and became friends with Robert Plant or whatever. I don't know if this I don't know if this sort of thing has ever happened before. It might have done, I guess, but I'm pretty sure it will never happen again. And even how many times in Taylor Swift's career do you think she's had breakfast with a fan and their parents with no assistant, no security, no handlers, just like, call my hotel room, I'll come down, have breakfast with you? How many times has that happened in the last 20 years with anybody?
And in a world of bad news, hearing that story lifts our spirits. And get the book, Ozzy and Me. And if you're burned out with all the stuff happening in the world and you want to go back to a simpler time with the Prince of Darkness, get the book. I really enjoyed it. Stephen Ray, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.